What's your experience from seeing mystical creatures? Redditor 51. We currently have several cats, but I lost a really special one here several years ago. We sleep with the door closed so they can't come in. Since Rupert died, when I'm in bed trying to fall asleep, it feels like a cat jumps on the bed and starts walking around like he's trying to figure out where he wants to lay down. But every single time, there's no cat in the room. I thought it was just me and my imagination until I asked my husband and daughter. It happens to them too. So now I just smile and tell him I love him. Redditor 52. A couple of months after my sweet calico fur baby died, I was standing in the kitchen, looking at my 2 new fur babies nestled up on the couch. I was still so sad, and wondered what my girl would have thought of her rambunctious brothers. I felt something rubbing up against my leg, and for a brief second, I saw my girl. Redditor 53. Kinda what you're asking for, but at the same time it's not. Oh well. I had stayed the night at my best friend's house. She was knocked out, but I was still up messing on my phone when I heard snoring. I rolled over to smack her but realized the snoring was coming from the floor on her side of the bed. I tried looking in the mirror on the other side of the room but saw nothing. The snoring happened the entire night. I did not sleep at all. When I was telling my friend and her mom about it the next morning, they told me it was one of my friend's old dog that still hangs around. She even had his ashes in her room too. Redditor 54. When I was in the 3rd grade, a classmate and friend of mine died from meningitis. It was pretty sudden and violent one day after diagnosis. He was also the son of my mother's very good friend. Her mother always had interesting stories, such as seeing him in the house, etc. Fast forward 6 years, I am babysitting his sisters that I have not seen in 5 years as my family, and I moved to France during that time and then later came back to Canada in that same house. I put them to sleep, go down to watch TV with their dog. I was peacefully watching TV, then in the corner of my eye, I saw a silhouette in the stairs on my left. The dog noticed it too. We both turned our heads at the same time. There he was, standing in the middle of the stairwell looking at me. I freaked out and immediately reached for my phone to call my mom. Once I looked back, he was gone. Redditor 55. When I was 13, one of my best friends was hit by a car and passed away instantly. I was a wreck and was grappling with the meaning of life and why the Creator, if they did exist, would take away someone so young. I searched online for any answers and came across a suggestion to write the deceased a letter and burn it. In my letter I asked for a sign to let me know if she was okay. Almost immediately after the paper finished burning, I heard a blood-curdling cry outside from what sounded like a young girl. It was late at night, but much to my surprise none of the other neighbors had awoken to the sound or turned their lights on. My brother heard it too and opened the front door. He told me he saw a large black figure, like a huge bear, bolt across our front yard. It scared it so badly that he frantically shut the door. This was in the suburbs far from any large creature, so it never made sense. I feel like I got an answer, but it wasn't the one I was hoping for. Redditor 56. I saw a shadow person. When I was about 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. It was a pretty old building in Pilsen, and according to his dad it used to be owned by So Capone, but I'm not sure how true that was. We had an apartment on the top floor that they let us use to just hang out, and it allowed us easy access to the roof out we could go smoke cigarettes. One night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'd meet him up there. After I was done, I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to guide us. We had those old flip phones without lights, so you only had the light from the screen to help navigate the cluttered mess that was up there. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. Now this wasn't like the shadow of something moving with the light of my phone. This shadow felt solid like a person. I followed the direction it went thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times, before heading to the other side of the attic, and that's when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, But it really freaked me out and I told my friend what happened and that I did not want to go back up there. Redditor 57, lighter story. Probably coincidence, but I like to believe it was a spirit. The heat went out in my parents' apartment when they were first married, old house that was sectioned into 2 living spaces. It was a really cold day and nobody could come out and fix the heater, so my parents were sitting around and trying to keep warm. My dad opened the back door to get some more wood for their fireplace, and a corgi just waltzes in. The moment my parents gave it food, water, and some attention, the heat magically came back on. As soon as the heat was working, the corgi left. My parents still talk about the magical corgi every now and again. Redditor 58, there was a ghost cat at my old house. I'd turned to greet my cat because it was so apparent there was a cat there. But then of course there was no cat. She was like a white ball of light. Redditor 59, so my beloved cat Socks passed away about 2 months ago. He was being taken care of by our family friend since our apartment is non-pet friendly, and he ran under her car when she arrived home and passed away. It had been about a week after his death at this point, and I hadn't cried yet, like it hadn't yet hit me that he was gone. I was lying in bed on my phone, at about 8 a.m. And I suddenly get this feeling of incredible sadness and grief wash over me, and I smell cat food. Specifically, the brand we fed all our cats for years. It had a very strong, distinct smell, so I recognized it immediately. I began looking around, and at the end of my bed, where it's right against the bookshelf, the shadows looked a bit darker than the rest of the room, like something was there, but not entirely visible. Something in my gut told me it was Socks, so I spoke out loud to him and told him I loved him, and that he didn't have to stick around for me, he could move on if he wanted. I told him about all our previous pets who would be waiting for him. I then felt a small wet patch against my hand for a split second. This is important because Socks had one of his front canine teeth removed, and this caused him to slobber a bit on that side. He'd rubbed that side of his face against me whenever he saw me. I then felt the sadness lift a bit, and the presence in the room disappear. I then finally began to cry. I haven't told my family yet, I don't know how they'd react, but I just know that was Socks coming to say goodbye to me before he moved on. Redditor 60, here is mine. It's a copy-paste from one of my previous comments. Just for a better understanding of my surroundings, I'm from Kentucky. Lots of wooded area and people love their guns, including me. I used to not believe that there was unknown stuff in the woods. I thought maybe Bigfoot, could be real, but I severely doubted it. After this happened, I know there is something unknown out there. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, Ruger AR-556 for anyone who cares, and bought a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business, because why the duck not? Reading up on the drum, I read they were amazing and rarely had any issues at all. This will important later. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test drive and sight in my gun a little better. Here's where everything went to shit. As I said above, Kentucky is super wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator and few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek that had a small path half cleared by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field our cows graze in, and where I sight in guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go to the field, I instantly felt like I was being watched, closely. I brushed it off because I've walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So, I keep walking and ignore the feeling of being watched, but at the same time, I'm aware of the feeling. I know I feel like I'm being watched, but I wasn't giving it any noticeable attention. The walk to the field along the creek is a very short walk, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling got so intense, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 should have been plenty. So, now I'm stopped, paying extremely close attention to what's going on around me and loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been dead for a while and rotting in the sun. I started looking around and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces. It was almost like it was placed there for me to find. The only thing was it looked like it had been dead maybe a day at most, and what I was smelling seemed like it was far more decomposed. This obviously didn't set well with me, so I double-timed it on the magazine loading. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Me being on edge, immediately turned toward the noise, gun ready but no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. At least 8 feet tall, probably taller. Very skinny. Imagine a grown man that weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. Very long arms, and it walked on 2 legs. Skin stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek while it walked. It also had a very weird walk, almost like a waddle, but taking large steps. But that could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer. That's all I can remember about it right now. I will edit it later if I remember anything else. Now I know why I felt like I was being watched. Magazine loaded, bolt ready to send a round in the chamber. Remember what I said about the magazine being extremely reliable? I press the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round just in case this monstrous thing decides to attack. I did not intend on striking first. The round gets stuck somehow and doesn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger, so why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that thing had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened, I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the thing. Gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing books it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just long enough exposure to it to get the details I provided about it. Now, for assumptions. It happened about late May last year. I still have the emails from Magpul regarding the drum, so I'm using those as reference because after this, I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided it could have been a ducking Wendigo. The reason we think Wendigo is because everything I described matches them near perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, explains the smell at the possum, very fast, can be several colors, light brown included, and that they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans again, the possum. The only thing that we couldn't come up with is its behavior. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. Didn't try to attack or confront me, it ran from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted me. This being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I have gone to the same field taking the same path expecting to be watched and have not gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day. Something was out there and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there and it still had no comparison between that day. Sorry for the novel, but I felt like I needed to include every little detail I could to better explain the situation. The little details really bring out how absolutely ducked I could have been. Every little thing just happened to line up to duck me. Edit for extra detail I forgot to add. Tons of Native American presence has been in my area. I find large amounts of flint every year, but the proof that they were here is the arrowheads I find. There is also a Trail of Tears site less than 5 miles away from my home, which is a possible origin point for it because I'm sure plenty of them got desperate on that. Redditor 61, I was walking down the hallway one night at home. As I passed a room I saw what I thought was my mom's small dog. I even heard small rummaging noises like he was sniffing the carpet. The dog looked slightly smaller and had longer hair than my mom's dog, but I figured I was seeing things since it was dark. Anyway, I walk into the living room and saw my mom's dog on her lap. My jaw hit the floor. Turns out, when my dad was a teen, the house on the property burned down and my grandmother's dog died in the fire. And I described what I saw and my dad said that sounded just like my grandmother's dog. Redditor 62, my dog died 6 years ago when I was in China. I never had a chance to say goodbye, as my mother called from CA and said he had stopped eating. She put me on speakerphone and he perched his head up. She was going to take him to the vet the next morning, but he never woke up. I remember coming home and my mother and I embraced and cried. We're Asian, so we're not very affectionate, but at that moment just sadness and love for our dog took over. That night I went to sleep and saw my dog in my dreams. I played with him for a minute and told him to wait as I went into my room to retrieve his toy. As I walked back out, he was gone. I think that was his way of saying goodbye. Exactly a year later I saw him again in my dream. He let me pet him for a bit and the dream was over. I never saw him again after that. Redditor 63, me and my friend were walking through his neighborhood at around 11 p.m. At the same time we feel a presence and look behind us. We looked back at each other and asked if the other one felt the same thing. As we were walking we could feel it watching us, and it moved to various areas around the neighborhood. We started freaking out and hid in his car until we thought it had left. We both felt it in the exact same areas, and the wind would move behind where we felt it, and nowhere else. Redditor 64, I've posted this before in another sub, but I'll put it again here because it's pretty relevant. This story is long. In fact, I made an amateur film based loosely on it and not for the faint of heart. It's probably exactly what Op was looking for, but be cautioned, you will never be able to unread this. By far the most creepy and terrifying thing I've experienced to date. My good friend Paul and I, both about 17, were headed to a nearby mountainous rainforest to spend the day foraging for mushrooms. We both had a couple of seasons worth of shrooming under our belt, having gone several times to this exact area in prior years, and a few times already in that same winter. After waking up early and spending about 3 hours traveling to this mountain range, we began into the rainforest the same way we'd always done. Our normal route was along an old, disused railway track that skirted about halfway up the mountain slope. It was good to have this flat ground to walk on, as we got deeper into the woods. After walking a while, we decided it was time to delve into the surrounding bush and start our mushroom hunt. We would normally go downhill from the train track when it was time to veer, as it was generally more moist the further down the slope you got equals more mushrooms. However, this time for some reason, we decided to try our luck on the other side of the track, and started walking uphill away from our walking track. We didn't have to walk very far from the path before the landscape started changing. The higher portions of this mountainside were drier, and started resembling a sparse pine forest as opposed to the normally damp rainforest that most of the terrain grew. The area was fairly open, and not filled with undergrowth or overgrowth. We split up a bit, to spread our efforts, still within earshot of each other, but not within eyesight. My attention was focused on the ground, constantly surveying for mushrooms. After walking up a small raised mound for better vantage, I noticed something strange on the ground, just on the other side of this mound I'd walked up. It was a man-made construction, that was for sure, but still to this day I cannot work out exactly its purpose, or why it was there. The best description I could give would be a large guinea pig hamster hatch. It was large and rectangular, 2 meters by 1 meter, but very flat and low to the ground, probably less than 30 centimeters high. On one end was an entry hole, and the entire structure was covered in corrugated iron and tin, and it looked like it had been there a while judging by the moss and leaf litter that was encrusting the roof and walls. I stood shocked and confused, trying to evaluate this structure as best I could. It was in the middle of a quite large ditch. That mound I had climbed before? Just part of the surrounding rim that cratered this ditch, where this structure was in the middle. Already I had thoughts of terror running through my head. A human could definitely fit inside this structure. Could this be some hobo's home? Or perhaps something more sinister? I still can't quite place the purpose of this hatch. As much as I wish it, the story doesn't end there. My shock paralysis at coming across this thing in this ditch was soon interrupted. I felt something heavy and wet land right on the top of my head. Before I could reach to touch my head, it was already oozing down my face and neck. To describe this material, it was thick like tree sap, but black as pitch, like tar. I'd never seen anything like it before, and seeing it on my hand was when I first felt the urge to panic. I looked up, to brave a glance at the source of this strange black substance, and that's when I knew I had to get out of there. All of the trees growing around this ditch clearing had massive globs of this stuff dripping steadily from their upper branches. I could see these masses of black stuff clear as day, and I would have noticed them earlier if my attention wasn't focused on the ground. Now, the icing on the cake. As I was struggling to process the situation I had walked into, I heard something moving in the area across from the ditch edge I was standing on. Now when I say I heard something moving, what I mean is that I heard the ground giving way to whatever was moving. The all too familiar sound of crushing leaf litter and twigs underfoot was nearby, in an otherwise silent atmosphere. However, it wasn't rhythmic, there was no stepping, it just came. Before I could rationalize what I was hearing, a large shadowy blur whizzed by, just in front of my eyes. It moved along the ground, and at lightning fast speed, darting between trees, as it was gone from my vision as quickly as it entered, leaving the sound of crushed ground as it went. My original thought was that it was wildlife, a kangaroo specifically. Yes, I'm Australian, but no animal moves that fast. I'd never been so scared in my life. As much as I wanted to move or scream for help, I was paralyzed. I knew my friend Paul wouldn't be more than 100 meters away, and that he was carrying a knife in case we got jumped, and that's all I could think of at that time. I broke out of the crippling fear, and sprinted toward where I thought Paul would be. When he saw me, I was as white as a sheet, trembling, crying, panicking, and for a while I couldn't make any words. I told him what had happened, and he naturally didn't believe me, or rather, wanted to get a look for himself, even after my cautioning. I pointed him in the direction of the ditch hatch and the surrounding tar trees, and told him I was getting as far away from there as possible. He caught up with me a few minutes later, having seen more than enough to confirm my story, and being sufficiently spooked himself. We have never returned to that mountain range, and it is still the scariest ghost story I have. Telling it always leaves me scared. I'm sweating profusely after just having written this, to give you a sense of how malign that day's events were. Why did all this phenomena occur in the same location, and all at once? From noticing the hatch to sprinting away in terror from the mystery shadow was probably less than 10 seconds, but it felt an eternity. And before you ask, no, I had not eaten any mushrooms. I understand the potential effects of some mushrooms, and would never jeopardize the quality of my forage like that. Redditor 65, I posted this story to a similar question around a month ago, but I was too late to the party. Here it is again. I saw what I jokingly called a chupacabra in Northern California when I was around 13 or 14. I was with 3 of my friends and one of their mothers driving home at dark. This is a rural area with houses every few miles. My friend's mom abruptly stops the car because she thinks she sees a naked child standing under a lone tree in a field about 50 yards from the road. We could barely see it, so she maneuvered the car so the lights could shine on it. As soon as we could somewhat make it out, this thing turned its head 180 degrees and looked at us right as it jumped straight from the ground into the fucking tree. It was a vertical jump of about 12 feet to the lowest branches. It happened all fast, we couldn't see its face. It was human-like in form, not any other animal. We peeled off so fucking fast. No one believes us to this day, but the 5 of us remember it clearly. I have no idea what it was. I still think about it to this day and will not walk outside at night because of it. Redditor 66, I lived in an old house in the country and I thought I would see cats all the time. They'd always be running around a corner and right out of sight. You could never quite look at one for long enough to see if it was really real. I'd search all over the house and never find them. Then eventually when I got a kitten they went away. Redditor 67, not my experience, but it happened to my husband shortly before we got together. He loves history and was visiting Gettysburg. It was dusk on the battlefield and he was near the angle, admiring a really cool old barn that was part of a small farm on the roadside. He saw a horse. Nothing special about it, just a regular dark brown or black horse, except that it had materialized out of nowhere right before his eyes and had kind of green eyes. It was running around the farmyard and he could hear the hoofs as it galloped. He felt a breeze as it ran by and could see the nostrils flare. It ran around for a minute or two and just disappeared. There were a lot of horses killed there, so it kind of makes sense that horse spirits could be restless there. Redditor 68, my cat Snowball came to visit me a week after he died. He jumped on my bed as if he came from the window, stared at me until I realized he looked healthy again. He had kidney and thyroid disease, so he was super skinny when he passed, then made a little meow purr noise that he did, climbed over me, and I assumed disappeared. I was afraid to look. I was afraid to try to touch him. Now I wish I had. ETA, to help you picture it, this was Snowball. Redditor 69, it is 11 o'clock at night and I have made the conscious decision to read these stories. I am an idiot. Redditor 70, normally I don't buy into this shit, but the other day I stepped outside of my parents' house while visiting in northern Maryland to call the dogs in. The sun was just starting to go down and I just happened to look up and this giant fucking bat was flying over the house and into the tree line. Now, I like bats. They're awesome creatures, and they get a bad reputation. When one gets into my house I catch it and let it go outside so he can eat bugs and go in his merry way. But this ducker was huge. I first thought that it was a buzzard, and had to do a double take because it was the wrong color, and it didn't have a tail like a normal bird. The buzzards here can get pretty damn big, 3-4 foot wingspan or more. And this bat had to have had a 4-foot wingspan. He wasn't that high up and just flapping away to clear the trees. Another time I was driving home up the mountain and it was pretty late, really dark out. In my headlights I saw the silhouette of a deer walking out into the road and I swerved to give it room. As I went past it, it was staring into my driver's side window and it had no face. Just a deer skull staring right back at me. I swear to whatever, I almost had a heart attack. It was the freakiest thing that I have ever seen. Redditor 71, I'm super late to this, so this comment will get buried, but I guess I'll post it anyway. When I was 7 or so, my parents watched movies like Ringu, the 1998 version, Rose Red, Pet Sematary, and The Exorcist with me. I loved watching scary movies, and I felt safe knowing my dog was there with me. One day, my father was mad at me for whatever reason, so he locked me in a dark closet to let me think about what I did. There was a lot more screaming and door punching than self-reflection going on. When I was let out like 30 minutes later, I think something changed in me, even if only just a little bit. I was shaken up and couldn't sleep alone, so I slept in my parents' bedroom for a while. Anyway, one summer day, I was watching Case Closed at like 4 a.m. When the episode ended, I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than some beauty sleep. Before I could go bed, though, I had to turn off the lights like a responsible kid. The problem was that the light switch for the living room was like 30 feet away from my parents' bedroom. Turning off the lights was always my least favorite late night routine, but I knew it had to be done. So on this particular night, I shuffled over to the light switch before I could make my 30 feet sprint to the bedroom. Just as I reached up for the switch, I heard the click-clacking of my dog walking down a hardwood hallway on the opposite side of the house. I looked over, and there he was. He just stood there, looking at me, so I called for him to come to bed. No reaction. Whatever, I guess. I thought nothing of it, turned off the lights, and booked it to the bedroom. When I got there, I quickly shut the door so I could jump into bed. The feeling of relief was short-lived, though, because on the bed was my dog. He was curled up and sleeping comfortably. I looked back at the door, but it was closed. I did not think of going outside to check what was back there for 1 second. I crawled under the covers and didn't sleep that night. I never saw that dog again, but that memory stuck with me. I get goosebumps and tear up every time I think about it, and this time is no different. A part of me wants an explanation for what happened, but at the same time, I really don't want to know. I honestly wish I could just completely forget it ever happened. Edit, a word or two. Redditor 72, my law teacher in 7th grade told everyone a story where her and her future husband were staying at a hotel bed and breakfast in Cape Cod. She thought it was a dream. It went like this. She woke up to a girl in her late 20s who seemed to a little bit pale and she seemed to shimmer. The girl was sitting at the desk and chair in the end of the bed. Mrs. Thomas sat up, and Mrs. Thomas and the ghost began to converse. They spoke of how the woman's husband was a wealthy captain who had died at sea during a storm, and she was waiting for her to come back. Her spirit was anchored to that room because that used to be her house, and she had a heart attack when she heard her husband died. Apparently, in the morning, Mrs. Thomas was about to tell everything to Mr. Thomas, and he stopped her as she started talking and said that he knew what happened. Mr. Thomas said he could not see the ghost of the woman, but he could very clearly hear Mrs. Thomas talking to the ghost, and their stories lined up perfectly. But the weirdest thing is, other visitors who stayed in that hotel room reported the same events happening to them. The ghost appears to women in their late 20s who are with their significant other when they stay in that same room. These stories happened with as long as 10 years difference, and all the stories are exactly the same, like it's so weird. Just for clarity, my teacher is now like 60 years old. Also the best English teacher I ever had, even though I hated her. Redditor 73, I swear that I saw a shadow dog walking through my kitchen, and I know it wasn't a corner of the eye thing because I was looking right at it as it walked around the kitchen table. Redditor 74, when I was about 6 I was at my daycare and it was nap time. I was laying on the floor staring at the door, and it suddenly seemed to get a lot brighter right by the door. For whatever reason I put my hand up and pointed at the door, and it opened, and then I closed my hand and the door closed. I did this probably a dozen times before one of the daycare ladies came in and asked if I was opening and closing the door, to which I said no. After she left I did it several more times, and I guess the lady was watching me from the hall and was genuinely freaked out and told my mom about it. Redditor 75, there's a spirit cat on my route to work. It's past an old hospital, and while there are real-world feral cats that roam the area, the spirit one never moves. It's a fat Himalaya that's always looking over its shoulder as I drive by, always in the same spot. My headlights make its eyes glow. Redditor 76, my sister was once bitten by a moose. Redditor 77, not sure if this counts, but when I did ayahuasca, I was absolutely sure my cat was there with me through my trip. He's always been my soulmate, so I didn't even think anything of it. Just as I didn't think tea was strange that I knew I was upstairs during my trip, even thought I was in a single-level dome. But he was there, swear to God. Redditor 78, when I was around 8-9 we were playing manhunt in my family's horse pasture. It was on the side of a hill lined by trees and fence. I remember it was dusk and I was hiding behind a trio of trees that grew together, and I hear a loud rustle from up the hill. I look up to the trees and there was a huge animal jumping from tree to tree. It jumped with all 4 limbs stretched out and grabbed the next tree. It looked way too big to be a bear, so I turned and grabbed my brother who was next to me. Yes, we weren't playing that well in manhunt, but when I turned around all we saw was the leaves and limbs falling from the trees. Never saw it again. Redditor 79, unfortunately I've had a couple. I feel like I have to specify that I'm a pretty normal bloke, and that the things I've seen or felt, even though they have been vivid and real, I still find it hard to say ghosts are 100% real. Anyway, my dad owns a pub in Wales. He had often told me that he had heard children crying in the pub when it was empty and closed. Many mystic type people have come in for a drink and made comments that it was busy with spirits. Anyway, one day I'm at the bar, it's dead, I'm in there watching TV. In the corner of my eye I see someone walking down the other end of the bar. I glanced my eyes back at the telly thinking it's just a customer. In that 1-second glance I reminded myself I was the only one there. I turned my head back to look down the bar, and there was this huge man with a long black coat, top hat and black featureless face. He moved around the corner and was gone. The next day a guy called Stan comes in, and without me starting the conversation he is telling a story about how outside his caravan last night he saw a man in a cloak and top hat walking through this garden. Redditor 80, driving home from a soccer field in a North Texan suburb not near rural land at all. I am totally sober and it is midday. I'm with my wife. I suddenly see what I at first think is a large, skinny dog crossing the road and slow down, thinking to try and collect it in case it was lost. My wife isn't looking. It is moving fast and I get this electric feeling in my body suddenly, and it jumps straight up onto a 10-foot brick wall lining the housing development. Dogs can't do that. I finally am close enough to see it and it looks right into my eyes. It's a fucking giant ocelot. The moment we looked at each other felt suspended in time. The moment I opened my mouth to get my wife's attention, it slinks off the wall's other side. The moment I saw it crossing the road till this point lasted like 3 breathless seconds. Of course, upon realization, I freak out, adrenaline pumping, screaming big cool cat to my bewildered wife and driving quickly into the neighborhood to see if we can find it. We did not, and she wasn't on my level about it, although she thought it was also a cool thing to see. I remember being absolutely thrilled. I was going through a somewhat tough time in my mental health at that point in my life, so it was cool to find out later that an ocelot, in the spiritual totem sense, means a sign of regeneration. I am doing well since then, so that's pretty neat. Redditor 81, I took peyote at this church out in the middle of nowhere in the desert in Arizona. The property had an old white horse that walked around. The people running the place told me about the Native American man who had founded the church and that he had died a year previously. So I'm sitting out in the desert by myself under the influence of the peyote and the horse wandered up to my area. I saw the horse's color is split right down the middle, half black and half white. Strangely, the split was front half and back half, not left and right as you might think. I knew that the old man's spirit was sharing the horse's body, and so one of the colors was him. I think I knew which color was which at the time, I just don't remember. The funny thing is I saw this as a fact, not something wild, just like, oh look, the horse is half Indian spirit. FYI, when I'm sober I don't actually believe in anything paranormal at all, including God. Redditor 82, so you know how America's national parks get closed down when the government shuts down? Well, here's my story from when I was the only person inside of Yellowstone National Park, at 1 a.m. I'm lucky enough to have 2 properties, on opposite sides of the park, which means I use the park as a highway. It's amazing, and you people need to respect the park rules. I get special access to the park during a shutdown since the road in the park reduces my travel time by about 7 hours. Anyways, the government had that shut down a few years back and I decided it was time to spend a weekend at my cabin. I got off work at around 10:30 p.m., packed and left for the night. Nobody in the park, pitch black out, no cell service out in the wild with incredible stars. Around midnight I have my first wildlife encounter, an owl swooping down through my headlights into the dark. Remembering that's an omen for death, I thought to myself, that sucks. Creepy. Then an hour of overthinking the owl, I go down a slope turn to see the most beautiful fox, just sitting in the middle of my side of the road, staring at me. I stopped my car with the headlights on it and just watched it sit there. He was not bothered by me, not I was of him. Remind you. Middle of the most wild area in America, with nobody around at 1 a.m. After about 20 seconds of staring at each other, he stood up and walked down the road, so I slowly followed. He trots about 50 yards down the road, the curved slope, and steps aside to watch me pass. I shit you not, looked up as I was passing by, looked me in the eyes, and he fucking winked at me. That all happened over the course of maybe 2.5 minutes. I did not sleep that night. Redditor 83, I'm Irish, from a relatively superstitious family. Not overly, but we don't duck with fairies and we always wave at solitary magpies. Anyway, my great-grandmother was a wonderful lady. We were very close and I was very lucky to have her in my life for so many years. She passed away at the ripe age of 102 years old in September '08. I was 15 years old, and around this time my mother and I were living in Dublin City, while my granny was living in a retirement home in a rural community around 2 hours away. The day she died, I had spoken with her on the phone and she was in good spirits. That night, around 3 a.m. I was awoken by the loudest, most horrific screeching sound I've ever heard. It sounded like someone was simultaneously murdering an opera singer while throwing a bag of cats around the place. I suddenly felt very cold and like I couldn't catch my breath. The screaming went on for about 3 minutes, and the coldness passed soon after, but I was just frozen in my bed with fear. About 2 hours later the phone rang and it was my Nana telling us that Granny had passed in her sleep peacefully. I don't know for sure, but I'm certain that screaming was not from anything living. I mentioned it to my Nana and she told me a story that when Granny was young, Her sister died and Granny heard the same screaming. She always determined it was a banshee, a fairy woman who appears to those whose relatives have just died. Nobody else heard the screams but me. Not my ma'am in the next room, not my neighbors next door. Just me. I get chills whenever I think about it. Redditor 84, I saw a wolf, a huge wolf when I lived in Ohio. I was working late and it was close to 3 a.m. I was driving home and one road has woods and the river on one side and a big subdivision on the other side. I came down the other side of a small hill in the road and saw something headed from the woods toward the road. It was moving so fast, and didn't stop when it hit the road. I slammed on my brakes and barely missed it. But it was taller than the front of my minivan hood. It actually made eye contact with me, as it ran in front of my van. Its eyes just seemed creepy, but I was scared at the size of this thing, so who knows? Everyone made fun of me and told me, no such thing as wolves in Ohio. I checked around and there was no other sightings. But here is the thing. I would have sworn it was a freaking werewolf at the time of the sighting. When I got home, I was like, I think I just saw some sort of werewolf thing crossing from the woods to a subdivision. No sighting since then either. Redditor 85, this was back when I still really believed in God. I was 14 then, I think. I loved my grandmother. She was my best friend, or as much as a grandmother can be to her granddaughter. She taught me how to knit and bake, and my happiest memories as a child were with her. One day she got sick. She hadn't been sick in years, but here she was, bedridden and getting thinner every day. But my grandfather deeply believed in faith healing, and so did she. So did my mother and everyone else, and I guess I did too. The doubt I felt was weakness, I thought. I was told. Lack of faith. So she got worse and worse, and I knew something was wrong. I asked my mom and my grandpa why such a kind and faithful woman would be experiencing this. Why punish someone like her of all people? They said God tests faith sometimes. I caught myself wondering why God's punishment of the wicked and testing of the faithful would look like the same thing, but I pushed that thought out of my mind. Still no improvement. Still no doctors, no hospitals. Still getting thinner. I took a walk one night and spoke with God. It had been hot lately, but that night was cool and breezy and silent. I asked God what was happening, what was the plan, what I should do. No answer, but that was usual. The answer came from your heart, I thought, so you could never hear it. You could never really know. You just had to trust. That's what faith was, after all. I lived in the country, so the stars were bright. Especially bright with the haze from the hotter days cleared. The clouds in the sky were all distant, and the moon was new, so straight above me, the stars were as vivid as I had ever remembered seeing them. And I asked in my mind if my grandmother was going to be okay. And just then, not a second after I had finished the thought, this soft, warm breeze rolled across the farmland and through the trees, and I looked up at the stars, and I was sure, so sure it makes me shiver even today, that I heard my grandmother's voice. I don't know what I thought she said, I just swear I heard it in the wind. And that warm breeze felt so much like a hug. I know that sounds stupid, and I guess it is, knowing what I do now, but at the time, it was as real as anything that had ever happened to me. I went home after that, convinced I had communed with something out there in the night. That was the easiest sleep I ever had. I went to school the next day and came home to an ambulance sitting in my driveway. My grandmother had passed in the night and my grandfather hadn't believed it was true until that afternoon. What I felt, what I heard, was all in my head. It had to be. I don't believe in anything supernatural now, religious or otherwise. But sometimes I remember that day, and I hear that voice in the wind, and I wonder what I really know. Redditor 86, I was on Sandia Peak in New Mexico. I was walking past an overlook maybe 75 yards from the crest house and an old man was standing at the overlook. I turned for a couple seconds to watch where my feet were going and then looked back. The old man was gone and there was a raven hovering in his place. There was nothing the old man could have hidden behind and the crest house was too far away for him to have gotten there in a few seconds. Freaked me out. Redditor 87, yes I have. I saw what I can only describe as a humanoid swamp thing-like creature breach the water in Port Charlotte, Florida. My wife and I both saw it, clear as day. We could see the white in its eyes. It came above the water almost like someone doing breaststroke, but it wasn't any known animal in Florida or anywhere. It was awesome. Redditor 88, wife and I were driving home at night and playing the quick draw game pretend to pull a gun from the hip, aim and say bang when wildlife was spotted. The first to do so would gain a point, so there we were, mowing down bunny rabbits with our pretend guns and scoring ridiculous amounts of point when we both looked forward and seen what can only be described as a naked man crawling across the road. Neither one of us drew our weapons and we both remained silent for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Eventually we speak and kind of freak out about what we just seen out in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town being close to an hour in any direction. I've done countless searches and research stories in that region, but the most I can come up with is that it was a mangy raccoon. Look that up if you want to have some nightmares. Redditor 89, lived in rural Idaho. Driving the back roads, some crazy stuff happens. Cars appearing out of nowhere and chasing you down, only to break pursuit at city limits. Sometimes humanoid forms, much taller than any man, prowling around haystacks. Sometimes train warning systems going off with no train, and then quickly turning back off. Anyway, this has happened to myself and a few friends. Not some story that they recreate to fit in with a group. It wasn't until we had all sat down one night that we all confirmed each other's stories. I will tell you of the two most convincing stories. I should start by saying that my grandmother is Native American, on my mother's side. Cherokee, I believe. What she would tell me was similar to skinwalker stories, though I know them as Navajo tales. So it may be related still, and might have influenced her telling of what happened. Anyway, we were about to cross a railroad crossing when the lights began to flash. We didn't see any trains, but my mother likes to follow the rules. Maybe it's a way to teach us to not cross any lines. Whatever it may be, we stopped there, waiting for the lights to stop. All of a sudden, my mother floors it. I still remember the squeal of the tires. We quickly start down the winding road leading to our house. This is unusual behavior for my mother, and so I ask what is wrong. She tells me that there was someone walking up behind the car. I chuckle a bit, because there are no houses nearby. Why would anyone be out there? She quickly speeds up, telling us, "Make sure you're buckled in." It's still following us. We're easily going 40 miles per hour. Surely nothing is that fast. I look out the back of the car to see a quick glimpse of someone towering over a 7-foot talk sign. That alone was enough to terrify me. All the way home, I was checking out the back and asking my mother if it was still there. My mother wouldn't answer, so I felt it best not to pry. I still get goosebumps driving down that road. Second account is from my friend. I will not be so elaborate with this story, but I will try to give you enough details. One night I was hosting an Xbox party. Just a bunch of friends hooking up to a router for long nights of Halo. My friend Zach shows up terrified. We are concerned and ask what is wrong. He tells us of a towering creature that was keeping pace along his car. First running, then dropping to all fours. He quickly describes what he saw. It was a few seconds later that it dawned on me. He lives less than a half-mile away from where I saw my creature. In this moment, my friends begin to describe similar encounters. I chime in with my own. We all decide to stay indoors for the night. A few months later, the same friend is worried again. He was riding his bike next to a cornfield near his home. He tells us that he was feeling watched, a very similar feeling to when the creature was next to his car. Sorry if I went overboard with my descriptions. Redditor 90, I know I'm late to this and no one will probably read it, but here goes anyway. I've had a few run-ins with things I can't exactly explain. First, it started with me lying in bed. I was about 8 years old. We lived in rural Ireland and my house was on a hill that looked out over fields. Anyway, this one night I'm in bed and I see a really bright light outside. It's late, so there should be no one coming to the house. I get up out of bed, look out of the window, and see this glowing orb flying across the field next to us, about 30 feet above the ground. It was hauling ass too. It didn't fade away either. The orb just kept flying, through hedges, trees until I lost sight of it. To this day I don't know what it was, my best guess is will-o-wisp. A few years later I was camping in our yard with my friend. We had a large plot of land so it wasn't as pathetic as it sounds. Anyway, we're both sleeping and then we hear this singing from out in the field. Buddy wakes up to it and then wakes me up because I sleep like a rock. We unzip the tent and look up at the house on the chance it's my parents playing music. Nope, no lights on and the singing is too close to be the house. We look around and my friend spots this figure walking slowly through the field. It was a woman. She was absolutely gorgeous, skin like cream, eyes like emeralds and hair that was like pure spun gold. Her voice sounded otherworldly, like 3 or 4 people were harmonizing about an octave or so apart. There was a little bit of a rasp too as well. Buddy wanted to go and talk to her, but there was just something off about her. I didn't trust her despite being compelled to go with her myself. I stopped my friend and we went back in the tent, closed it up and just tried to hide in our sleeping bags. Lastly happened a few weeks ago when I went home to get married. I live in Canada now and my wife decided she wanted the wedding in my home country because she had never really been there. So we're over for the wedding and arrive a few days early, so we end up going to Loch Lomond. I was born in Scotland but lived in Ireland for a while for 2 nights, so we're staying at a hotel pretty close to the loch and our room looks right over the water. It's pretty early in the morning. Sun hasn't come up yet but we're awake because of jet lag and time change etc. Anyways, wife is looking out of the window and calls me over saying, "Oh look, you guys have wild horses here too," and pointing towards the water. We don't. I go to the window anyway because I really hope it's not what I think it is. I get over there and see this ridiculously tall horse, bigger than a Clydesdale, and it's just standing by the water. Next thing we see is the horse walking into the loch and just disappear under it. Like literally just walking till its head went under. As that happened the sun finally broke from over one of the nearby hills. It was freaky. My wife, who has never believed my tales about the Fae and other myths, is now a staunch believer. I'm convinced we saw a Kelpie.